And now we're thrilled to talk to Monica West. Born and raised in Cleveland, Ohio, Monica is a graduate of the Iowa Writers Workshop, where she was a Rona Jaffe Graduate Fellow. She has received a fellowship from Combilio Fiction and a residency from Hedgebrook, and she currently lives in Oakland, California, where she is reading everything that she can get her hands on, teaching high school English, and writing another novel. Monica, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
Teaching high school English is hard. Are you kidding me? Why are you trying to write a book and do that? That's too much work.
So hard. What it doesn't say is that I've been part-time since Iowa. So I used to teach full-time high school English. Now I'm teaching part-time, and then next year I won't be teaching high school English at all. I'll be teaching at USF, a visiting assistant professor of fiction at USF. So, but I've been teaching high school for 14 years.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
That's heroic.
Okay.
And congratulations on your new gig. That's very cool.
Thank you.
Well, we're very excited to talk to you about your debut novel, Revival Season, which was published at the end of May and has gotten rave reviews. It follows an evangelical family, the Hortons. And in your book, the Hortons take to the road for Revival Season, during which they hope to save as many souls as they can. But their patriarch Samuel is in trouble. I wonder if you could start us off in this talk by reading from the book.
Absolutely. So the section I'm going to read takes place right at the beginning of the family's the Hortons. The oldest daughter, Miriam, is 15, and she's the narrator of the book. She's a first-person narrator, and they follow the father around. They are kind of with him over the series of these summer revivals, and then this first revival, something goes wrong, and Miriam sees something that really disturbs her. And this is kind of the aftermath of that. The family has to leave the revival tent after everything kind of goes awry. And this is Miriam's kind of reflection on what's just happened, and she doesn't quite fully understand what she's just seen. A wave of nausea churned in my stomach as Papa made the processional inside. He slipped on a wan smile and stepped behind the pulpit, raising his arms to signal that it was time for the call to worship. The deacons were supposed to join him on stage, but they stayed with the congregation, leaving only Caleb in the semicircle of chairs behind Papa. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. These words, usually met with applause, were greeted with cacophonous silence. The microphone screeched, but Papa continued speaking, even as his words were inaudible over the crackling feedback. What happened last night? A voice from the back of the tent yelled above the din. You put him in the hospital. Ma stiffened beside me as she wrapped the long strap of her purse around her hand. I shifted my eyes to the right to avoid a conspicuous turn of my head and counted the fast blinks of her confused, glassy eyes, watched the slightest tremble in her top lip. My eyes skipped from her to Caleb, who was seated behind Papa on the stage, gripping both sides of the folding chair as Papa raised his arms to stop the congregation's incessant shouting. But the voices kept coming, one after another. A preacher wouldn't do that to someone, a woman's voice shouted. You are no preacher, some man said. With each declaration, Caleb drifted farther away from the stage until his eyes were pointed somewhere over my head at what I imagined was an object outside of the tent's open flaps. My neck snapped around for the first time all service. The seats were mostly empty, and the faces that stared back at Papa were full of anger. Papa looked down at his papers as though the answer was written there. He adjusted the wireless microphone behind his ear, but his lips didn't move. Saints of God, I want to talk to you about the mysteries of faith. He was yelling now, but their booing drowned out his amplified voice. Ma rooted in the side pocket of her purse until the keyring was in her hand. With each new jeer that rose behind us, she gripped the keys tighter in her fist until only a spike of silver stuck out. She scooted to the front of her chair, planted her black heels squarely on the grass, and stood, pulling me up with her. We had never left a revival early. The jeers got louder behind us as my hand hooked under Hannah's armpit to bring her to her tottering feet. Soon we were speed walking out of the back of the tent. We burst through the line of deacons, and Ma ran at full speed to the car and started it. I was just finishing buckling Hannah in when Papa and Caleb appeared, illuminated by the individual circular ground lights that shone outside the tent. What was that, Samuel? Mama asked after getting out and sliding into the passenger seat so Papa could drive. Let's just get out of here. No, what were those lies they were saying? You didn't hurt that man. You just tried to heal him. Did something else happen after the revival service? We can talk about this later. He tossed his arm around the passenger seat and looked backward into the rear window. The van zipped away from the tent in reverse. We're going to talk about it now. Her words rose at the end with a sharpness that was reserved for times when she was angry with me or Caleb. I never heard her use that tone with Papa. Papa ignored her until Ma grabbed the gear shift and jolted the van into park. My head crashed into the back of the driver's seat. I threw out a stiff right arm to keep Hannah in place. You need to go back there and tell them that it's all a misunderstanding. We're not going to run away from here like criminals. Tell them. Ma's words knifed through the minivan's air as she leaned close to Papa's face, her crooked finger pointing in the direction of where she wanted him to go. Papa released his hold on the steering wheel as his shoulder slumped. They had indicted him back in the tent so he wouldn't have to admit anything that hadn't already been said. Besides, we confessed our sins to one another regularly. Ma had told us about her anger at God after Isaiah's death, and Papa had confessed to being prideful. This would just be another confession in a line of confessions. And if he said it was wrong, if he admitted it and repented, we could pray for him and find a way to move forward. Tell us, Papa, I finally said with feeble words. I should have said, tell them. They don't know anything. They're lying, all of them. There's nothing to tell. I had leaned forward behind him, straining against the taut seatbelt as I awaited his explanation, but I flopped back into the seat after hearing his flat, false words. Ma placed her left hand on the steering wheel, preventing him from driving off, but his two hands on the wheel wrestled it away from her. He jammed his foot on the gas and turned the wheel so hard that Ma's body slammed into the door. I began. Ma and Papa snapped around and looked back at me as though I had interrupted their private conversation. You saw nothing, Miriam. His eyes narrowed in the red-tinted darkness from the stoplight overhead. As he held my gaze, daring me to defy him, a flash of heat passed through my feet and made the tips of my toes tingle. Then a bubble of rage rose to my stomach and popped. He knew that I couldn't. I snuck a glance at the revival tent receding over my left shoulder. I knew it was bad luck that looking back turned Lot's wife into a pillar of salt, but I couldn't help myself. A ribbon of exhaust streamed from the back of the car, tethering us to the people inside before the tent released us into the dark.
Thank you so much. That's a completely gripping scene. And we're going to talk more about the family in your novel in a bit. But first, your book has been out in the world for, I think, 5 whole days as of today.
Yep.
It's published on the 25th, and we're talking on May 30th. Congratulations. And I can't help but note that while the Hortons can hit the road, you can't, or at least not quite yet. And we're speaking in what I might describe as kind of a hinge in time. The pandemic shut so many things down, including book tours. And now they're kind of starting to open up again, or maybe they're about to. And we've just been talking to Whitney's editor, Sean McDonald, about this, but we want to hear from you about how it feels for a writer. How has that uncertainty affected your experience of planning for and promoting your work and sharing this thing that has been with you for so long and now is ready to kind of go out into the world? And it's a different world than maybe the one you expected.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think that I first sold this book pre-pandemic in February of 2019, and everyone has this idea of what a tour is going to look like, what publication is going to look like, what all these things are going to look like. And then I remember when I first found out that my date was going to be spring 2021, I found myself being really kind of disappointed. Oh, that's so far. And I have to wait 2 years for the book to come out. And then the pandemic hit. And I was like, oh no, please take as long as you need for this book to come out until things feel a little bit more normal. So there was a ton of uncertainty when I was talking to my publicist and my marketing team at the beginning of January is when we first kind of planned out what this was going to look like. And even then they were saying, we hope in person, we're not sure, wait and see, let's find out. And so when I finally got tour dates and those things, I think that maybe it was the beginning of May when I knew for sure that things were going to be virtual. And so everything was virtual, no in-person events. And that's what I kind of learned. And I understood it. I'm disappointed, of course. It's really nice to see people in person and do things in person, but that's how I found that out. What I'd love to do is something, and I've been talking to my agent about this, something maybe later in the summer that feels a little bit farther away from the pandemic, that does feel a little bit more in person than the Zoom events that have happened. But it's been an experience publishing a book during this time, but it does feel nice to be publishing it on what feels like the waning part of the pandemic, as opposed to kind of the beginning of it. But the one thing that I've learned in the pandemic, one of many, is people are still reading a lot, and that's been really lovely, and that's been great to see.
The vaccines would have been announced by January. I mean, you would have known, right? But nobody knew how quickly they would start or when mask mandates would start to fall and where that would be. So it's just like, it seems incredibly hard for your publicist to try to guess about that sort of stuff. Did you have those kind of conversations? Well, how quickly do you think people are going to get vaccinated, and check the New York Times website to see what it says, you know?
Right. It's funny. Our conversation, it's not funny. Our conversation was on January 6th, so the day of the insurrection. So
Oh my
we had it in the
God.
morning.
God.
I know, but we had it in
And
the
then
morning.
this happened.
Right. So right around 10 my time is when that conversation happened. And then the insurrection started kind of happening later on that day is when, those events were happening. And there was so much people didn't know about when the vaccines would roll out. I live in California. And so, what it would be like to travel to some states where I'd be having readings and what others, other stores' rules are and those types of things. And so we did have those conversations. I think it was so soon then to know what vaccines were going to look like, what rollout was going to be. And then, yeah, so it's just kind of, I just put my faith in them and said, okay, I trust that you know what you're doing, and I'll follow along with your guidance for that.
Have the way that this got planned and that you ended up having to do in person, do an online tour for the most part, has it opened up any opportunities that you might not have otherwise gotten to do you think?
I think what's been really lovely about doing a Zoom tour, an online tour, has been, I think, a lot about people, my parents, for example, who live in Ohio, and the fact that my parents have been at my events, and that would have never happened pre-Zoom. And even my students, for example, my students in San Francisco can log into things. My launch event was in Oakland, so they could have come to that in person, but I had a secondary event with Square Books in Oxford, Mississippi, and I had students I had parents in there. I had friends of mine who could have never traveled. And so that's a really nice thing I think about Zoom, is that it removes that barrier of travel for people who want to log in, and it kind of makes that easier. And the other thing I think I appreciate about the Zoom experience is that there are cities that you would never travel to on a book tour. And there are people that you would never get a chance to read to, and people you'd never meet, and people who will always say, oh, I'm in this such and such city, but your tour is not coming to my city. And the Zoom experience has allowed tours to be more fluid, and allowed people who may have never had, maybe never been to a book reading because they are in a city that, doesn't get tours very often, to actually log into and experience what it feels like to have somebody read, and to have that experience of buying books, and, the way that they're kind of signing book plates and sending them out. And so whatever that, the approximation of that normalcy, but it does open it up to more people.
Spoken like a true Midwesterner, or at least one brought up in the Midwest, because now all these people that you're living around in California are just like, well, they have them in California. Why would they need to have them anywhere else? We don't need to have a book reading anywhere else.
Exactly. I actually had a really funny experience when I was teaching here in California, when I got into Iowa, and I was teaching 10th grade, and I told them I was leaving and I was going to Iowa. And the first question was, they were so sad. And the second question was, where's Iowa? I had in the middle of my 10th grade class, it became a geography class about, hey, kids in California, there are things outside of California and people who live there. And there are more than just two states in this country of California and New York. So it was also a geography lesson in the midst of an English lesson.
That's great. It's funny to think about, the ways in which this has not brought me face to face with new people, but brought me something with new people. And this experience of, I feel like so much of what I remember about book tour is, of course, the pleasure of seeing my friends and loved ones, in different cities, but also meeting a reader who would be really enthusiastic and I didn't know them. And I think of your book in a certain way. It was funny to read it and think about the conversation that we were going to have, because in some ways it's actually it's partially a road trip novel. Mm-hmm. And the Hortons are on this evangelical trip. They're Baptists. They travel and they meet new people all the time. And I'm curious about how the experience of travel and meeting strangers is connected to evangelical faith. And if you can talk a little bit about the challenges of writing about that kind of road trip.
Sure. So I think that part of the idea of travel is important to this kind of evangelical faith that this family possesses. Is their mission is to save souls and convert people, and as many people as possible. And so this idea of proselytizing, spreading the word, spreading the gospel has to be something for them that spreads beyond what their current little town in Texas. And so they have kind of a lock on that place there, but so much of what they do is meeting new people on the road in these revival tents in these other cities that, they just go to in the summers. And so that's part of it. The other part of it that seems really interesting about this is there are these week-long events or these 5-day-long events that this family's kind of here and then they just disappear. And so they're not connected to the places where they go. And so there does feel like this element of, we're here, we're doing this, we have this mission to kind of convert you and save you and to heal you. And then we're going to do it somewhere else. And we kind of repeat the show again and again. And so I think that's the part of the evangelicalism, the proselytizing, the spreading the word, and, the preaching to all nations. But in this case, it's, in the South in particular. And so that seems particular to the faith in the book. And there are a few challenges of writing a book that takes place on the road a lot. Number one was keeping this idea of this very confined, claustrophobic space fresh for a reader and fresh for myself. It's a van, and it's a van for a fair chunk of the novel. And how do I make a van interesting? How do I make what's happening in a van feel alive and different and not redundant and monotonous? And so I try to focus a lot on the interactions in the van, also kind of more where they get to and more the places where they go, as opposed to being in this van for a really long time. But a lot of tension. I was kind of trying to build up a lot of tension and make tension feel new each time they were in the van differently. And I think another challenge of writing this novel is they're just kind of, they're nomads. They're kind of moving around from place to place. So it was a ton of research to get try to get those places right where they go, and also try to kind of show their interactions in these places in a way that felt authentic to the family, authentic to these places, and authentic to this faith that they're kind of trying to, pass along to the people that they meet.
It seems really hard. I was just thinking about several years ago, I went on a temple tour of South India with my parents, and I'm friends with a writer who lives in a certain town, and we passed through her town, but we did it so swiftly that I couldn't meet up with her. And she sort of messaged me back like, "Don't worry, I understand, you're on the holy smear." I was like, it's true. I had seen so many religious places and met so many people so quickly that they all sort of blurred together. And that also seemed like it might be a challenge because you're constantly introducing new characters and they matter, and then they kind of immediately also don't.
Mm-hmm.
So there's sort of an episodic quality, but then there's things of consequence that happen in all of these different spots.
Right. I think one of the things I remember during my my first semester, my second year at Iowa with with Margot Livesey, and she was saying that the things that happen here have to matter. And so when I was kind of doing the initial beginning of the book, I was just more interested in, here's what this place is like, and here's where they go, and here's the scenery, which I could do all day, but that's not interesting to anyone but me. But this idea of make something matter here. And so even though they're meeting new people, there are some that fall away, but each of them kind of builds up in this arc of what's happening with him and Samuel's fall. And so the people I introduced, though their names may not be important by the end of the book, the experiences he had with them seemed to matter and seemed to be weighty in some way. Also, another thing that was difficult was deciding what to summarize and what to keep in scene. So this idea of what healings get summary, and what healings get full scene. And the ones that got seen were the ones where something of consequence happened that then stayed with them. The residue of that event stayed with them even as they moved somewhere else.
I mean, craft-wise, you're talking about the difficulties of keeping the novel fresh, but being in the van all the time. But sometimes those kinds of restrictions can lead to innovation, I think. And it helps sometimes to know what the novel's not going to be, and to put limits on it. At least that's what I tell people a lot of the time. I grew up in a religious family, so I don't think I've ever seen a faith healer, but I've definitely seen people speak in tongues and like lay hands on each other to heal through prayer. So there were scenes in there and a vibe that I was familiar with. Did you grow up in a religious family, and what kinds of faith are important to you now?
Mm-hmm. I did grow up in a religious family, but not this type of religious family. So I grew up I'm from a Baptist family. And so the same denomination that I grew up in is a denomination in the book. But in the sense of not a ton of familiarity with, I didn't grow up going to tent revivals. I didn't grow up seeing faith heals. I've seen people, I've seen healings and laying on of hands. I've seen a lot of prayer. I've seen those types of things, but in church services and not in a separate space, not in kind of a tent revival space. I mean, I have been to tent revivals and I did a lot of research on those, but that wasn't my upbringing. So I grew up Baptist, one Sunday, Sunday morning Christians. And, that's how I grew up. And then, but my parents no one's in the clergy. They have secular professions. And I went to school, it was public school. And for me right now, faith has been, I still consider myself Christian. Like that's still my faith. And I still go to church. But I think that one of the things that has been complicated about it is that my faith is really strong and really important to me. And the more I kind of grow in that, I go to Baptist church a bit. I don't consider myself Baptist much. I go to kind of non-denominational churches now, but and I try to go to more inclusive churches. But the idea of kind of the difference between personal faith and then the larger structures of church have been really problematic for me. And so that's, I think, where the book came from, is this idea of kind of what do you believe in and what gives you kind of a true north and a center and a sense of ethics and purpose. But then there's this larger thing that puts things on you, and you don't believe a lot of the things that this larger structure believes. And so that's, I think, the split that I've been feeling with my personal faith. And that's kind of how I describe it right now.
So I think just going back to the earlier conversation we had about your book, I think one of the things I love about your book so much is that I'm interested in the politics of kind of communities and their self-critique. And there's so much of that in this book. And thinking about, what an in-person book tour might have meant for you. You might have been in conversation with readers who are religious, attached to this community in some way, attached to other religious communities, atheists. I mean, who knows, right? The kinds of conversations you might have had in person, it could have been really different. And I think that it seems like a thing where virtual conversations are going to have a different quality, maybe be more inclusive, reach more people, but also have different levels of intimacy. And it also seems like church is a thing that's been contentious during the pandemic. We should be able to gather for worship. That's a protected right. No, this is a problem for public health. And I wonder what kinds of conversations with communities of faith you will seek out as part of sharing this work, and given the circumstances, how you've already planned to do it, how you might plan to do it in the future.
That's such a great question. I think the first part of it, which is the idea of kind of self-critique, or the idea of critiquing from within a community, I think it matters to me as well. And the idea of I think I could critique a different community, but I can critique this community really differently because this is community that I consider something that matters to me and something that feels important. And I thought about that, the idea of kind of what an in-person tour could be. And I mean, I've had people reaching out to me via email saying, hey, I've been a member of a church for this long. And, that would be a really different conversation in person, to kind of have people I think will come to this book from really different ways and paths. And to have somebody reach out to you and say, I felt this way my whole life, I'm still in this church, or I felt this way my whole life, and that's why I left the church, and that's why I'm an atheist now, or that's why I don't believe this anymore.
Or that's why I don't like your book.
That's why I don't like your book. Exactly. And that's why you're a terrible writer. You should never write again.
Stop saying bad things about my church.
Right. And then, and religion is so contentious. So this idea of even writing this book was, I mean, when I first started writing, I didn't think about the publication process. I just wanted to write it. And then after then I was like, I'm writing a book about religion. Why am I doing that? And people have so many opinions about it. But I think that what I hope it inspires, and I haven't quite thought about my role and what that's going to look like with communities of faith, or communities that I believe I'm speaking to in this book. And that's communities that I've either been a part of or I've left, or communities that maybe I'm still a part of. That I think that what I hope it does is helps people just interrogate larger systems. I think everybody has an individual experience of some form of belief, and it doesn't matter what you believe in, right? Everyone has some experience of believing in something, just people believe in different things. But it's this element of the structure and the kind of larger overarching structure that I think this book is trying to critique, and that I'm trying to critique. And so I hope it opens up a path for people to say, just because I believe this specific thing, just because I worship in this specific place or do this kind of ritual or practice, I'm allowed to feel really differently about this overarching thing that exists that doesn't feel like it aligns with how I believe and what I feel. And that's what I hope a larger conversation is. I have to think through what that looks like. I mean, it's a conversation I plan to have with people in my church, and I don't know if they're going to be happy about it, and that's kind of okay. But I imagine that it's going to be something that involves this idea of the personal and then the structural, and the idea of what happens when the structural no longer serves the personal, and what happens when the structural is actually really flawed and problematic, and how can one navigate this idea of personal faith without, I don't know, without in this structure that is really that also needs to be changed.
I mean, it's interesting to me. I have a lot of students here at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. I mean, not a lot, but every 2 or 3 every year, right? Who are coming to us, our program, from deeply religious backgrounds, usually around in Missouri or Arkansas, sort of rural areas, Tennessee maybe, who are trying to figure out, like, okay, they want it out of that community, and they have real critiques, right? But they're also, so they're thinking of two audiences, right? They're right. They know this community is going to read this thing, but they also know that, like, secular people in New York are going to read it, who have an already preconceived position about that community, and they're trying to negotiate that. Gerard Conley, who we've also had on the show, was dealing with that in his book. I wondered how you thought about that, like your two different audiences that are potential readers here.
Yeah, I think that I thought about that a lot. Once I got past this idea of this book being for me and kind of thinking that maybe it's something that I could do more with, or getting feedback on it, that there's something here that you should keep working through, I thought a ton about both. And I feel two things. I feel, number one, it is very common, and especially with certain secular communities or communities that have really negative experiences with religion, to write off this family and to say they don't believe in what I believe. They're dumb. This practice doesn't feel, it's not real, and all these things. And I want,
therefore I don't have to care about these people. Exactly. They're like outside of my experience. That is a real problem to solve in a novel like this.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things, number one, I think one thing that I hesitate to say this, but one thing that I think that the last 4 years of the previous president has taught us is that there are lots of people in this country who feel there's so many people. I used to think I speak into a vacuum of people who believe just like I do. They have the same politics I do. They have the same beliefs I do, and not the same religion that I do, but the things that we believe in. We vote for the same presidents and the same kind of people in city council. But there are a lot of other people in the world who do not believe how you believe. And I think that one of the things in terms of this book for me was that thinking about audience and having a professor at Iowa say, well, people aren't religious, who's going to read this book? And reading, what I teach my students about is reading is an act of empathy. And there are so many books that I read that have nothing to do with how I was raised, how I was brought up, what I believe. There are books I read that fully contradict these things I think to be true. And those other voices and viewpoints matter. And I think that to be an individual in a society, and to be someone who's aware of the world, means being aware of lots of different sides of the world. And granted, you don't have to read everything, you don't have to agree with everything, but I think you should try to expose yourself to things, and even things that you disagree with. And just kind of, of course you can write it off. You can read this book and throw it to the side and say, oh, I don't believe in them, and I don't believe like they believe, and I'm just gonna kind of cast it aside. Or you can say, I see some fundamental humanity in this character, even if I don't agree with what she agrees with. There are some universal things, which is this idea that everyone comes to a point where they kind of find some larger thing that they disagree with. Everyone has at some point felt some sense of not being heard or represented, or feeling honored for kind of what they stand for in larger structures. And so even if you don't have the same system that Miriam has and her family has, that's okay. But I think there's some humanity in this experience of reading something that's different, and seeing and finding ways to see yourself in something, because you can't always see everything that you want and everything that you are reflected in a piece of fiction or nonfiction. So that's the first thing I would say. And the second thing I would say is, for the two different audiences part, it is such a tightrope, because what I did want to do is make sure that I left room for people who are people who identify as deeply religious to see themselves, and people who identify as not to see something in there that's interesting. So I leave some things wide open. So in terms of the healing scenes, you can say, I believe that fully, and I've seen that, and I've been in those rooms. Or you can say, this is fiction and it's magic and it's all these things that these people believe in that I don't believe in. And I think that I try to leave a little bit of room and ambiguity in the book for all those types of readings into it. But I am aware of feeling accountable to how I grew up and what I still believe in that community in some ways, some parts of it, not the whole parts of it, because some parts of it are really awful and terrible. And also being accountable to people to make this book not so narrow that people who don't see themselves in it can't find a window in. So it has, it's a really tricky balance. And I don't, it remains to be seen if that has worked for people, but that's what I was really working to do.
Well, I thought it worked for me. And I thought that, I think it's really important. I always tell people, I have students who are writing this, and obviously you're not a student, you're a very successful writer, but, people need to know about these. This is an undescribed part of the world, that these communities are both black and white, that they are not, they're not, there's all kinds of space here that is not being touched on.
Right.
And that to touch on, to describe undescribed places is one of the rules that a novelist has.
Right. And this idea of to give voice to people that people can overlook and have been overlooking. And so here's the super tricky part of that, though, is I also recognize that in this country, Christianity is the dominant religion. Christianity causes a ton of harm to a ton of different groups of people, marginalized people. Christianity marginalizes people all the time. And so recognizing that there is power, that it's not a structure that, when people talk about feeling disempowered by being Christian in this country, people who are Christian, the majority in this country, not in the world, but in this country. And so
I'd like to imagine that they're being persecuted all the time. So.
Right. It's like, but you're not. And in some ways, maybe you are. And so that is also a tricky thing, which is these communities, like this small community of faith and this, this family, their experience is singular in some ways. And if they went into a market in New York, someone would probably make fun of them for how they're dressed and whatever. But but there are lots of them in this country. And so there is also that element of, it's hard to feel a little too persecuted when, you are the majority in this country, in lots of ways, and a lot of the power brokers and a lot of things are happening, and people are upset with things and making their voices heard primarily because they identify with this larger religious structure, which, is not always doing, I think, amazing things. So there are larger parts of the religion, I think, are kind of, like I said earlier, are harming people. And there are pockets of good as well. And so there's that.
Speaking of self-critique, as we were, so many religious institutions crumble because authority figures, and usually clergy, often men, are revealed to be flawed in some way. And your book made me think of not only the church, but also the family as a religious institution that could crumble in that way. And Whitney mentioned a previous guest, and this, I thought of a different guest we had, Megan Phelps Roper, who was way back in December 2019, came on and talked to us about belonging to the Westboro Baptist Church and leaving it, and talked to us about her experience of writing, about emerging from that set of beliefs and language to develop her own. And that made me think about your protagonist, Miriam. And Megan spoke about the Westboro Baptist Church's desire not to change minds, but to publish, right? Predestination sort of meaning that people were going to believe what they believed, but so Westboro was just going to say what they wanted to say with no goal to change. But in revival season, the Hortons are seeking to persuade and to convert and to change. So I'm curious about how you thought about depicting the relationship between that goal and the role of fate or God's will, which does come up for the Hortons.
Yeah, I think that's such a tricky line for families, for religious people in particular, which is their whole goal is in this evangelical goal, which is we need to save people, heal people, convert people, baptize people, get as many people as possible to believe what we believe, which is what we say is the truth, and these sets of beliefs in God and what God does and how God reveals himself to people. And that's what this family believes deeply, deeply, deeply. And so their service is to then take other people and make them believe the same way. And so I think that what's interesting about that, which is what happens when this thing of I need to take this truth that is it's a tenuous thing, right? Because in as much as it can provide a lot of comfort and clarity and answers. Like any, lots of religion can do that. It gives us comfort, it gives us clarity, it gives us purpose, it gives us a sense of ethics and morals. But then there are also so many other questions that it opens up, which is kind of one of the big questions of the book is, what's the nature of suffering, right? And we can't always answer that. We can't always, there are things that fate also then has a role in that Samuel has no control over. There's this larger, he wants to believe that he can control this larger narrative outside of himself, and he also can't. And so that's how Hannah as a character comes into the book, as a sense of, what are the limits of my power? And in as much as I want you to believe what I believe, and he starts to see himself as this kind of godlike figure, until even after he is revealed to have been a bit of a fraud, he still sees himself that way and can't quite dial back on his rage, can't quite dial back on his pride. But there's a big question mark in his family, even with his daughter, with his youngest daughter, with his stillborn child Isaiah, of there are things I cannot control. There are things I cannot do. There are things I cannot heal, things I cannot save, people I cannot reach. And that's way bigger than me. And I think for Samuel, he would love to make it everything instructive. It's all a lesson. But I think even he can see that there are things that he has no control over. But his pride makes him spiral out of control when he realizes that there are things that are bigger than him in this world. And this world in particular, his family, in the world of his church, in the world of his faith and his belief. And I think that's part of where he starts to, there's lots of reasons why Samuel falters, but that's one of them.
I often think about the economic reasons that people turn to religion, because what I notice in books that I read about this, and what I noticed in growing up, was that people who had run into an economic dead end or did not know what to do with themselves, quite honestly. Like, one thing the church will do is accept you no matter what. And you get to walk in the door and suddenly you have purpose, even if you don't have a job, or even if you're sweeping, the toilets at the Texaco station down the road. And you're valuable in a way that maybe the economy or the capitalists or, the people at Bank of America don't think that you're valuable. And I feel like that is one of the things that is not often explored as an attraction for faith.
I think that's a fantastic point. And I think that one of the things that I try to do when I deal with the revival tent scenes this is a swath of the whole community. And people come in who, you come into maybe this tent, right? Not necessarily into religion, but you come into this tent down on your luck, and no one asks you kind of where you live, what you do, how much you make. A lot of the attraction of that is come as you are, right? And come as you are, there's value in you, there's value in what you can do, even if that value doesn't translate to, you may not be able to serve and, preach or do these things, but there's value in who you are. And a lot of people haven't heard that. And that's why I think religion is really attractive. And there's value in what you are, and you matter to God, right? That's the larger thing. You matter to God, you matter to something, this kind of being and purpose outside of yourself.
And the one thing you must do is believe all of this stuff we're going to tell you. Yeah. But if you do that, you're good to go. Yeah. And I sort of feel like that's the way the Trump administration was staffed, which was one of the problems for them. Like, all you got to do is believe that this guy's really great, and you can be White House communications director. But like that is kind of like how religion works. Yeah.
And the other part of it is too, which is we see something in you, right? And if people are always telling you there's nothing in you that's valuable, but we see something in you, oftentimes that service comes in, it can be a little bit, you can think of it as kind of being utilitarian. You serve a purpose, you can do this one thing for us. Sometimes that also becomes economic, which is you can then tithe and give and worship, but if you believe these things that we say, you're fine and you're in. You have to, confess it and believe it and be baptized, or in this faith in particular, and believe it. But it doesn't leave room for actually asking questions. You have to believe this thing on these terms, similar to your Trump administration kind of analogy, which is apt. But you can't ask questions. And when you ask questions, doubt is, considered. Whether you doubt God or whether you doubt the person who's bringing you the word of God, that's often an issue. And that's one of the things too, I think, why lots of people are not staying, in certain faiths, or people are not staying in something that's, if you can't ask a question about something, then how does something fully serve you or fully be able to meet your needs? But yeah.
And I think one of the great question askers of your book, of course, is your narrator, Miriam. And the book is in so many ways. I mean, some of what we're talking about here, like self-critique, questioning. I think I referenced patriarchy before. Right? The book has powerful women characters. A lot of the self-critique of the community is coming from those women characters in different ways. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about women in the community that is depicted in the book and how you researched and thought about that.
So one of the things that this denomination, or their particular faith that the Hortons have, that's valuable to them, is we see men running the show in all the really conspicuous ways, right? The father is behind the stage. There, the semicircle of deacons sitting behind him. There's his heir apparent son, who we get the sense it doesn't really kind of want to be there, and is, but is there, and then is kind of on the side of the father. But then on the flip side of it, we see all the roles of service, right? The serving of dinners, and the filling up of drinks, and the bathing of sisters, and the caring for children, and that emotional work being relegated in some ways to these women. But yet, if you think about it, even with Mrs. Cade, the midwife in the Texas church, so much of the power in these churches comes from women. Women do the work behind the scenes. They get none of the credit, and they get all of the, in this case with Miriam and Joanne, all of the abuse, right? But none of the credit, none of the power, none of the glory that comes with being in this life or being in this family. And I think that the questions are asked by the people who are not served by this faith. And so Joanne, I think still feels too wrapped up in this idea of her finding her husband, Samuel, and then also finding religion at the exact same time. And so she's having this really hard time separating her husband from this idea of God and from what saved her from her childhood. And so she's not able to kind of extricate those two things. But Miriam is starting to, because from the previous summer, she's seen something that she tried to kind of reconcile and make sense of and tried to believe. And then she has to really think about what would happen if this happened not to be true, and how would I live in the world if this thing happened not to be true. And so that's something I've been thinking a lot about. And she's allowed to question primarily because, number one, the church isn't serving her, and her father's beliefs are no longer serving her. And so then she's left with, well, what do I do if this doesn't serve me? How do I figure this out without something that larger helping to kind of guide my hand in this? And I think that's been her real struggle.
Monica, thank you so much for joining us and for such a wonderful conversation.
Thank you so much for having me. This was a pleasure and a joy.
Thank you. And listeners, please go check out Revival Season, Monica West's debut novel, which is out now.